Greetings to all of you. I'm Timothy Muse, lead pastor here at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Alliance, Ohio. It's a joy to be with you today on this, the fourth session in our study of the book of Paul's letter to the Romans. If this is the first time you're joining with us, I certainly would encourage you to check out our previous episodes to see and get caught up as to where we are. If you're returning, welcome back. It's great to continue on in this incredible, dense, and rich book on Christianity and Paul's theology and his understanding of what it means to be a Christian. I would encourage you to have a Bible before you. Paul's letter to the Romans is in the New Testament, which is in the second half of the Bible. It comes after the book of Acts, after the Gospels in the book of Acts, so it's the sixth book in the New Testament. It is the first of Paul's letters. Paul's letters really make up a large chunk of the New Testament and really a large chunk of our understanding of what it means to live as Christians in the world today. One of the things I've mentioned in the past, but I want to reiterate, certainly for you to keep in mind, is that when we peer into the writings of the New Testament, when we peer into writings of Paul and Peter and James, what we need to keep in mind is that most of these writings came out within 100 years of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. Actually, many of them came out in the first 50 years of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. So when we look at the timeline, many believed that Jesus was going to ascend into heaven and then return immediately. Paul was one of those believers, actually. Paul believed that Jesus' coming was going to be immediate. So as time stretched on, and as people started to die, believers started to die, and as history progressed forward, then we had to figure out how to live as Christians. Christianity was no longer just a salvific promise of a future, but it actually needed to become a way of life. And in Rome, there were many people who lived as Christians, but also as Romans. So how does one live a sacred life in a secular culture? That's one of the things that Paul's addressing for us. It's one of the things that Paul really digs into. It's one of the big questions that Paul has to address, because most of the believers in Christianity during Paul's time lived in the Roman Empire. Rome was a very powerful empire at the time of the early church. So it really brought about some really big questions about how to live as faithful followers of Jesus Christ in the midst of this secular world. And it wasn't just a benign secular world. Rome was very much about Rome. There was really very little individualism and freedom as we understand it in the United States today. Rome really focused on the power center of the Roman Emperor. And as long as you followed what the Roman Emperor did, you were in good shape. But it was a militarily controlled empire. Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, was garnered at the tip of a spear, if you will. The people were afraid of the Romans. Think back to Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem on what we know as Palm Sunday, and the Pharisees and the scribes crying out for Jesus to silence the crowd. Part of it was they didn't like the fact that Jesus was getting all these followers, but the other part of it was their concern for Rome. They were concerned that Pilate or one of the leaders would send a garrison to wipe out the Jews, because that's what Rome did. When you stood up against Rome, they responded with overwhelming force. It's actually really no surprise if we think about modern context. George Lucas, when he wrote the Star Wars sagas, he crafted the empire around two distinct identities, one which grew from the other. That was the Nazi Empire in Germany during World War II and Rome. And the Nazis really adapted a lot of what Rome did. But Rome would respond with this overwhelming force. And as long as you followed the rules, everything was great. There was peace. If you didn't follow the rules, they'd wipe you out. So it's into this culture, into this hotbed of thinking and socioeconomic environmental experience that Paul is writing these letters about how to live a Christian life, about how to be a Christian in a world that is saturated with not only secularism, but also debased secularism. Rome was a very hedonistic culture. Anything you could want in Rome, you could get. And when I mean anything, I pretty much mean anything. I won't go into specific details because I don't want those words recorded but anything you could possibly want in Rome, you pretty much could get. And so here's Paul writing to people who are Roman citizens, and they're trying to figure out how to live this life of Christian understanding and Christian basis in the midst of Rome. And as they're looking around them, they're seeing a lot of what's going on. They're seeing a lot of terrible things happening, and they're asking those base questions, still base questions we ask today, of what is it, why is it that evil propagates in the world? Why is it that people do bad things? Why is it that God allows people to do bad things? And Jesus talks a little bit about this in the Gospels, and Paul is really pushing it further, and he's pushing it further right away. He's pushing it further and really beginning quickly in the book of Romans to identify that the behavior of the people in Rome is not acceptable. He does not want to see Christians being co-opted into this secular belief structure, into this secular understanding. He doesn't want anybody to think that you can be a Christian in private and a Roman citizen in public. That you can have the proclamation of Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior with your lips, but not live it out in your life. And unfortunately, I have to say that I see a lot of people do that. I see a lot of people claiming Christianity, claiming Jesus as the Savior, as their get out of hell free card, that somehow Jesus is going to swoop in the future and take care of things. But at the same time, not living that in the world today. And it's obvious in the way people live, in the way people talk, in the choices they make. And I'm not necessarily saying that they're evil, okay? Please don't hear that. I think there's a lot of really good people doing really good things. It's more benign. It's more that this Jesus fellow doesn't have any radical impact on their daily life. And that's what Paul's going to address in a lot of what he writes about, in most of his letters, but we'll see a lot of this in Romans, is this radical life change that comes with proclaiming Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. And it really should still come as a radical life change for us today. And for those like myself who really never knew otherwise. I never knew anything other than life in Jesus Christ. I was baptized when I was 4 months old. I was raised in a life of faith. That radicalness, though I can't equate one to the other and say, this was my life pre-Jesus, this is my life post-Jesus, I certainly can say that living a Christian life is still radical in the world today. Doing what is right and following Christ in the world today is still a radical notion. Because there are many who are driven by, passion or desire or self-fulfillment or some other belief structure that we see permeate even in our world today. So I think that Paul has a lot of good stuff to say, even still today in the midst of what we face. So we're going to jump into it. Just kind of backtrack for a moment from last week. Paul talked about the wrath of God being revealed, and that, it's against the ungodly, the wicked, those who, by their wickedness suppress the truth. Known by God, being known about God is plain to them because God's shown them, but they have turned away from it. So that's kind of the backdrop. Paul very quickly is going into this question, and I would imagine that this question was probably brought to Paul prior to his writing. Paul would have gotten a lot of information from all the churches he either wrote to or he planted. That's the word I'm looking for. Sorry about that. And there would have been like the frequently asked questions. And this probably would have been one of the frequently asked questions. Why do people act the way they do? Do they need the power of the Holy Spirit? How is God revealed? Where is God revealed? All of these types of questions. So this is really where Paul goes very quickly in the book of Romans, is to address this idea and start to talk about it. So he's talking about people exchanging the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal human beings or birds or four-footed animals or reptiles. So he's really talking about people in Rome. He's talking about everybody. Because one of the things that I think that Paul is really clear on is that every human being, as we go back to Genesis, every human being is created in the image of God. Every human being has the spark of the image of God inside of them. And I think every human being, if they would really dig deep into their own identity, would acknowledge that there is something greater than themselves. Some may not, and I'll go out on a limb and say that. But so for Paul, the knowledge of God, the knowing that God exists, that there's something greater, is in all of us. And this is not a naturalistic theology. This is not a kind of a universalist type of understanding. For Paul, he believes that God's identity and knowledge is embedded deep within us, in our own being. If Paul knew about DNA, he would say it's in our DNA. It's in our bones. It's in the foundation of who we are as people. Because we as people are birthed, if you will, from this great creator being. Though any person, there are many people who don't have connection to their parents. Every person is birthed, except for a few. Well, actually, every person is birthed by an egg and a sperm. That's how human procreation happens. So every person has a biological mother and father. Now, whether that biological mother and father they knew, whether it happened through the natural insemination process, there's some room to wiggle there. And I'm not discrediting anybody, but every person comes forth from an egg and a sperm. That's how it works. So everybody knows that that's the basis of their existence. And for Paul, I think he would say that everybody in the basis of their identity knows God, knows the divine. Now that divine may come forth in many different names, Yahweh, Allah, Vishnu, but there still is some knowledge of the divine that resides deep within us, some spark of understanding and some guidance that says that there's something greater than us. We're not just baseless beings that figure it out every time someone comes around. We have this knowledge, this passing on. And with that knowledge, with that understanding, there's a God who, a divine, I will use the word God, but there's a divine who directs and guides and molds and protects, provided that individual follows in the path of that divine. Which leads to the question, why do people do what they do? What is God's role? Is God, why doesn't God punish? Well, this is what Paul says, and we're at verse 24. Therefore, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the degrading of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. So Paul's basically saying that God took the hedge of protection away, took this divine bubble, if you will. If we want to imagine that God, in grace and love, wraps all of us in a divine bubble, if you will, that divine bubble of knowledge and guidance, teaching us what we need to know, teaching us about the sanctity of human life, the sanctity of our own bodies, the sanctity of other families, the sanctity of marriage, the sanctity of relationships, that these are all embedded in us. They're all part of this natural process of what it means to be human. And they're passed on from generation to generation. We learn systems and we learn experiences from those who have gone before us. But those who have turned from God, those who have given up on God, those who have said, I want the secular, I want to feel good, I want to enjoy, what have you. God doesn't strike them down. God doesn't kill them. God doesn't eliminate them. God just removes that bubble, if you will. God removes that active protective layer. God says, look, I'm going to love you and take care of you, and I'm going to watch over you and protect you, but you got to buy in. You got to buy in that there's something bigger than you. You got to buy in that there's something greater than you. God, for lack of a better word, and there really isn't a great word. So what God does is God just gives them up. Gave them up to their hearts, gave up the lust of their hearts to the impurity. So God let the sin that was being held at bay, God let the sin that was being held at bay loose. God popped the cork, if you will, of that protection and allowed just the base sinful brokenness to come forward. God gave them a choice. And we all have a choice. I mean, salvation isn't a choice. Salvation is done for us by something that we cannot control. That's a gift from God. But we have the choice of whether we're going to actively live into that salvation or not. We have the choice of whether we're going to actively follow the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and the teachings, or we're not. Does that affect what God does? Well, that can affect God's choice, of course. But we have the choice as freed human beings to follow in the path of faith or not. So Paul says, you know what? God just gave them up. Why do people act the way they do? Why are people doing these things? Because God gave them up to the lust of the passion of their hearts. God gave them up to the sin that resides inside of them. God's not punishing them. God's not striking them down. God's not smiting them. I've been waiting a long time to use the word smite. God's not smiting them. God's not thrashing them. God's just taking away that protection. God's saying, okay, if you don't want to follow what I'm giving you, this innate love and grace, then go ahead. Allow the evil and the passion in your hearts to reside. I'm just going to allow it to happen. Think of it this way. As a parent telling a child not to stay up late, but to go to bed and get good sleep, and the child doesn't. Well, what's the outcome? They may get punished, but the reality is they're just miserable next day. And most parents would just give them up as a learning experience to that moment. So God's not punishing. God's just not keeping that at bay. God's not surrounding the people with good guidance and good knowledge and good information. So he goes on. This is verse 26. Therefore, for this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameful acts with men, and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. Now this is a really tricky text. This is a really heavy weighted text. This is a text that has been used for a long time for the argument against same-gender couples and the such. And I'm really not going to wade into those waters. That's for a whole nother session. And I know there may be some who want to grasp it. But really where we're at here, and I think what's really most important to grasp, is the natural versus the unnatural. And when we talk about natural versus unnatural, Paul isn't talking about pleasure. Paul is talking about procreation. Paul is talking about advancement. The natural binding between man and woman for procreation, for advancing the species, for growing and giving birth. Same-gender couples can't naturally procreate. It's just not possible. And that's just basis of nature. And I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying to plant my flag on one side or the other, okay? Again, that could be for another session. But I'm not trying to do that right now. But these are texts that are in front of us, and we do need to confront them. We do need to talk about where Paul is at. And Paul is really driving at that people are driven by passion. It's the passion that's important here. The degrading passion. People are driven by pleasure. They want to feel good. And in unnatural relationships are driven by pleasure. And it can actually be an unnatural relationship between a man and a woman. And that would be a relationship, though it's natural by biology, it's not natural in commitment, it's not natural in investment, it's not natural in emotional support. So what's happening here is that women are seeking the pleasure of other women and men are seeking the pleasure of other men just because they're being driven by pleasure. They're being driven by the right now, the moment. I want to feel this and I want to feel it right now. Without a concern for the ramifications of it, either physically or emotionally or familially or what have you. And the other aspect that Paul that I mentioned earlier, in Rome, you could have anything. And so people were driven by pleasure. Rome was a very pleasurable culture. People were driven by pleasure. When you went to visit someone in Rome, you were offered one of three things: food, bath, or sex. And you could have them all. There was no particular order. You could have any kind of food. You could have a wonderful bath, a wonderful cleansing, whether you were by yourself or not by yourself. You could have any kind of intercourse. Because that was Rome. Rome saw that when their people were happy, everybody was at peace. So they allowed just about anything. They allowed people who were married to go off and do whatever. There really was no ramification or recourse outside of the self. The gladiators, if you think about the Colosseum, why was the Colosseum so big and so powerful? Because Rome felt if the people were entertained, they wouldn't rebel. It's a great sleight of hand. If the people are happy and entertained, if we allow actions A, B, and C to take place, then while we're over here doing X, Y, and Z, nobody's going to pay attention. We'll tax them to death, but they're happy, and so they'll pay the tax in order to be happy. This is great baseline human behavior, and we still do it today. We still do it today. Now, I want you to think about something. I want you to think about something here now. Sports are returning, and we're going to be looking at full capacity stadiums for football and baseball and hockey and basketball. I think hockey and basketball right now, I think they're still in their bubbles, but they'll probably be back next fall. And people are paying an astronomical amount of money to sit in a seat. Why are they doing that? Why are people paying $200 a seat for an NFL game and looking to buy $20 shoes? Because an NFL game brings pleasure. It brings excitement. It ends the drudgery of daily life. Rome knew this. So in Rome, you could get whatever you wanted. And it was pretty much okay. There are very few things that Rome didn't like or didn't approve of. Cannibalism was one of them, believe it or not, which is kind of amazing that in the hedonistic culture of Rome that they didn't like cannibalism. But they didn't like cannibalism. That's why the Romans were so fiercely against Christianity. Because they actually thought that Christians were actually eating flesh and drinking blood. Like literally carving somebody's bicep off and tapping into the jugular. Okay? Which obviously, after 2,000 years of Christianity, we know is not the case. All right? However, Rome had a big problem with the whole Eucharist understanding, the whole eating and drinking. So that was one of the primary things. The other primary thing, obviously, is Christians weren't proclaiming Caesar as a son of God. They were proclaiming Christ as a son of God. But that's a whole nother scenario. That's a whole nother aspect. But so what Paul is writing against here, Paul is writing against less about the act, okay? Oh, excuse me, that went right up my nose. Less about the act. It's important for us to not just zero in on the physical nature of what Paul is saying here, but also keep in mind that they're being driven by these unnatural passions, these degrading passions, that pleasure, physical pleasure, is what's driving people to exist. And physical pleasure, my friends, is the easiest pleasure to acquire. Think about it. I want you to think about it for a minute. You're having a bad day. You're having a bad day, the car broke down, the kids are crazy, the dog won't stop barking. What do? Eat some ice cream, maybe a piece of chocolate, or maybe have a drink, a cocktail or a glass of wine. Your body, you experience that rush of chemicals by eating that pleasurable food or drinking that alcohol. Physical pleasure, physical satiation. That is the easiest thing for us to acquire. And Paul's taking it to the extreme. It is about the act, but it's more about the people turning from what God has designed as natural and necessary to just being driven by baseline passion, by baseline pleasure. Again, and none of this is, and here's the thing, none of this is going to get someone kicked out of salvation. Paul doesn't say that God leaves them forever and kicks them into the outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's not what Paul says. Paul says God just gives them up. Sorry, I'm still got a little bit of water on my nose. Paul says that God just gives them up. And when they're given up, when they're given over to the degrading passions of their lust, of their hearts, of their sin, then they're not looking for commitment or investment or advancement or future. They're just looking to feel good. And you know what? In our world, that's pretty much where we're at. We can feel good. I'm having a bad day, so I'm going to eat some chocolate. I'm going to have a glass of wine, and I'm going to go on Amazon. I'm going to buy what I don't need just because clicking that button is going to make me feel good. Getting that Amazon box is going to make me feel good. I don't need anything, but I'm going to go to Target, and I'm going to purchase something at Target just because I want to feel good. We're no different today. We're still in a lot of ways driven by the degrading passions of our heart. Those passions may be different. The acts may be different. But what is underneath it isn't. God provides all that we need. All that we need. God is abundantly gracious in all that we need. But we can also provide a lot more for ourselves that we don't need. I mean, think about it. I want you to seriously think about it. Look around yourself right now and ask yourself, do you have just what you need? Or do you have more than what you need? Is there something that right around you right now that you could give away and your life wouldn't be changed in any way? I'm going to hedge a bet that that's probably the case. That's what Paul is talking about. Paul is talking about God giving people over to their passions, to their degrading passions, to their pleasures. Because God has set a course and the people aren't following that course. Since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, this is verse 28, God gave them up to a debased mind and to things that should not be done. Now, and here's the thing. Now, and this is really why I want to make sure that we focus less on the act and more on this passion, this pleasure, because Paul's pretty clear. It's not just about sex. It's not just about sex between men and women and men and women and women. It's more than this. He says it. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, acknowledging God really comes down to acknowledging the fact that there's something greater than themselves to which they belong to. And Paul says that God left markers everywhere. Creation, food, love. I mean, all these things are markers that this isn't just some big cosmic accident. We're here for a reason, a purpose. If you go into creation theory, between creation and evolution, pure evolutionists would claim that, out of the Big Bang, two molecules came together by accident. They were in the same path, same place, exploded, created the soup, evolved over billions of years. Modern creation theory, I don't necessarily think modern creation theory would really differ too much from that, except that maybe those two molecules, if God chose the Big Bang to create, those two molecules were divinely inspired. Choice. So, if the moment of creation is a Big Bang, that science tells us, the Earth is, 4 billion plus years old. If creation is the Big Bang, the real question comes down to, was it by accident or was it done by a larger being, God? If God chose to say, "Let there be light," and there was light, and that light was a big explosion in the darkness, well, then that's God's choice, and that's the difference between creation, being created by a divine entity, or evolution, which is just one big cosmic mistake, cosmic accident, chance. I tend to believe that we're not here by chance. I don't like the idea that we're here by chance, because if we're here by chance, then we're living a whole lot of goodness towards each other that really doesn't matter. I think it does matter, because I think that God has us here for a reason. We don't always know what that reason is, but I think that God has us here for a reason. But since they did not see fit to acknowledge God saying there's something greater than myself, okay? God gave them up to the debased mind and to the things they should not have done. So God gave them up. Again, God took away that bubble of protection. God took away that divine inspiration. God took away that hedge, if you will. God didn't just demolish them or eradicate them. but God left them to their own self. And really, quite frankly, if I would be totally, completely honest with myself, if God left me just to myself, I don't think I'd last very long on the path that I'm going. If it were just up to me. Many of you have probably heard me say, if heaven were up to me, it would be a very empty place. Well, but it's not up to me. And God has got me wrapped in this bubble of protection that guards my heart and guards my soul. Does my sin come through? Absolutely it does. Sometimes it comes through more than I wished it would. But even when that sin comes through, God hasn't given me up to it. God hasn't given me up to my sin. God hasn't given me up to the broken nature of my existence. But here's the thing. They are filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice. So again, like I said, it's not just sex. When God's talking, and if we're really truthful, wickedness, evil, covetousness, and malice, they're all They're pleasurable feelings. All of those are driven by pleasure. I want to feel better. So in order for me to feel better, I've got to have what you have. Well, you're not giving it up to me. You're not giving me your car. You're not giving me your house. So I'm going to plot. I'm going to use wickedness. I'm going to take what you have. I'm going to be envious of what you have. I'm going to covet what you have. I'm going to have malice, anger, hatred for what you have. These are all pleasure feelings. They may not be pleasurable, but they're pleasure feelings because they allow me to have this pleasure expansion. So wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious towards parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Now, I want to be clear. That list that Paul gives, that's all of us. That's all of us. Every one of us can find ourselves on that list, probably in more, maybe most of what's on that list. That is the basis of our broken, sinful nature. That is the basis of our existence. It is through that divine intervention, that continued divine protection, that our evil and our envy and our malice, our gossip, our slander, our insolence and haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, all that is tempered in our passionate heart. I want you to think about the last time you got angry. We all get angry. Anger is a natural human emotion. Like laughter or joy, contentment, anger is part of us. But anger has a way of overcoming our senses. Anger has a way of short-circuiting that protection, that hedge. I want you to think about a time in your life where you're so angry you went and did something stupid. Punched a wall or broke a vase or maybe sent an angry text or made an angry phone call or said something that you know you didn't mean, you know wasn't right, but you said it anyway. Anger is one of those emotions that can short circuit and really in a lot of ways show the true nature of who we are as humans. Show our true nature as broken. Show why we need the divine's hedge of protection around us. But what Paul is saying here is that again, God didn't eliminate them. God gave them up. Now, what's the purpose of giving them up? The purpose of giving them up is twofold, actually. The first one is because God doesn't see fit to continue to pour energy into something that's not wanted. Like any good relationship, You know, if you're in a relationship with someone and you're pouring energy into it and they're not pouring back, at some point you just go, you know what? I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pouring this energy into something that I'm not getting anything back. So that's the first thing. But why didn't God eliminate them or crush them? Because God is always hopeful of transformation. God is always hopeful of redemption. God is always hopeful that those who are living into the debasement of their minds, living into this pleasurable, passion-driven life, will come to realize that no matter how pleasurable it is, it has no value, no purpose, no worth. Things are things. And I think time and again, even in our own spheres, even our own existence, we know people who have been driven by the passions of their heart, the passions of pleasure, only to come to realize that that passion leads to just a very empty road. A very empty road. So it's really important for us to see this list. And again, this list, gossip, slander. Why do people gossip? People gossip because they want attention. I mean, look, if I would say, hey, I know something that nobody else does and I want to tell you, well, that makes me feel really good. But if I'm going to gossip about someone, what else does that do? That lifts me up because now I'm tearing that person down. So rather than elevating myself through the gift of the Holy Spirit and the power of Christ, I'm elevating myself. I'm making myself feel better by telling gossip about someone else. Hey, I saw the pastor go into the grocery store the other day with a really cute blonde-haired woman. I mean, I don't know who it was. Could have been his daughter, but I saw it. And what do you think that meant? There's a reason why God laid these out in the Ten Commandments. There's a reason why God gave the Ten Commandments. Because people in general will strive to make themselves feel better and build themselves up by tearing someone else down. I don't have to be the best. But if I'm better than you, then I feel good. Wickedness, insolence, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil. Inventors of evil, that's a really good one. People who go out and purposely invent evil. God gave the people up to this. God said, you know what? I don't have the energy to pour into this relationship this way. I can't keep protecting you if while I'm doing that, you're just going to go out and deny me, hate me. God also believes that good people who have bad moments can come back. And I was going to begin to say, how many people do we know that fled from God for one reason or another? Wealth, power, fame, whatever it is, only to come to realize at the end of the day that doesn't have any value. It's just stuff. You're alone in an empty house. Big, beautiful, empty house. With no one to talk to. I mean, that's the Ebenezer Scrooge story, or many other stories like it. And again, why is this? Is God just having a bad day? No. They know, this is verse 32, they know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, yet they not only do them, but applaud others who practice them. So, Paul is working under the knowledge that people know God's decree. Whether these are Jews who know God's law, or whether these are just humans who know that God is there, that deep base knowledge, that know that God is there and God expects more and wants more, but yet people don't do them. And so not only they do them, but they applaud others who do them. So it's like, woohoo, the shackles of this, the shackles of this God who requires us to love each other and care for each other. Those shackles are gone, and we can just go off and be who we want to be, and you can be who you want to be. And you want to go out and be wicked? Go out and be wicked. I'll go out and be wicked with you. Paul is making it very clear, this isn't God having a bad day. This is God removing the protection and allowing that sinfulness that resides in all of us to flow out. And it's there. Again, I said it before, it's there in all of us. And the more we draw closer to God, the more we realize that it's in all of us. The closer we come to the divine, the more we realize just how much it's in us. But I don't want to go too far in that because that's kind of where Paul is leading in the next chapter. But we see here, that Paul has this belief that everybody, knows God in the depth somewhere. And they've chosen, whether their knowledge is just deep and innate or whether it is actually practiced, they've chosen to turn away from God. And that choice has led God to draw back that hedge of protection, to draw back and allow them to be who they desire to be. Allow the sin of their hearts to come forward. All right, my friends, we're going to stop here today. I gave you a lot. I gave you a lot to think about. Again, like always, if you have any questions or thoughts, my contact information will come up at the end of this session. You can reach out to me. I'll do the best I can to answer them for you. So feel free to. We'll see you next week. I pray that whatever your day brings, wherever you go after this, whether you have watched it at the premiere or watching it later or watching it the next day, whatever it is, that God does continue to encase you in that bubble of protection. And that you and I, all of us, strive to lean into what God is asking us to do. This is more than just a story written a couple thousand years ago. This does apply to us today. We are right there in that list. And it is by God's grace that those things aren't bubbling up inside of us. But we'll see you next time. God bless you.